You know that feeling that some stories weren't simply lived, but written by a greater hand. Well, yes, there are moments in life when you stop, look at the details and think, this can't be coincidence. And look, I'm not one to go around looking for signs in everything, but there are stories that touch us in a different way, you know. Those narratives that seem to have been stitched with golden threads, where each event fits together so perfectly that even those without faith stop and reflect a little. That's exactly what happened when I learned about the story of Carlo Acutis, an Italian kid who lived barely 15 years, but who's moving crowds all over the world. And it's no exaggeration, okay? We're talking about a young man who used the internet to spread the faith, who created websites about Eucharistic miracles, and who, even after passing, continues to touch hearts. His spirituality was so authentic that even those who never set foot in a church become interested in the story. When we think of saints, that somewhat distant image immediately comes to mind, doesn't it? People from centuries past, with lives almost impossible to reach, full of sacrifices we can barely imagine. But Carlo Acutis completely broke that pattern. He played video games, wore sneakers, loved pets, and spent hours on the computer just like any teenager today. The difference is that he transformed these simple things into instruments of evangelization. While other Christian young people his age were just consuming content on the internet, Carlo was creating. He put together a virtual exhibition about Eucharistic miracles that traveled the world, showing that you can be a saint without stopping being authentic. Religion for him wasn't heavy, boring, or distant from reality. It was alive, pulsing, connected. And that, my friend, is the kind of faith testimony that makes a difference, because it shows that holiness isn't about being perfect, but about being real with God. But there's a detail in this story that catches everyone by surprise. Carlo died at 15. Fulminant leukemia. In a few days, the kid full of life, who got up early to go to Mass, who had a deep devotion to the gospel, and who lived with a smile on his face, was gone. For the family, it was a blow no one expected. For his mother, Antonia, it was the beginning of a devastating grief that seemed to have no end. But this is where the story starts to get truly intriguing, because Carlo's death wasn't the final point, it was just the beginning of something much greater. Testimonies started to emerge, accounts of intercessions, of answered prayers, of lives transformed through this young man's memory. What seemed to be a senseless tragedy began to reveal layers of purpose that no one imagined. And his mother, in the midst of all that pain, began to perceive that perhaps, just perhaps, all of this was part of a greater plan. But hold on, because this part of the story is just beginning. Imagine for a moment what it's like to lose a child. There are no words in any language that can describe that emptiness, that feeling that the world split in two and will never be the same again. Antonia, Carlo's mother, lived exactly that. After the funeral, when everyone returned to their lives, she stayed there, in that house that suddenly seemed too big, too silent, too empty. Every corner reminded her of her son, the computer where he spent hours cataloging Eucharistic miracles, the Bible he read every morning, the family photos where Carlo smiled with that joy that was his trademark. Grief wasn't just an emotion, it was a physical presence, heavy, that accompanied her from when she opened her eyes in the morning until she managed, with great effort, to fall asleep at night. And in the midst of all that, there were questions that wouldn't quiet. Why him? Why so young? Why just when he was doing so much good? But here's what's curious, and it's something that marks this whole story. Antonia didn't lose faith. She could have, you know. No one would judge her if she had turned her back on God, if she had shouted at heaven demanding answers, if she had abandoned the church and everything that reminded her of religion. Many do when they go through such pain. But she didn't. She kept going to Mass, kept praying, kept alive that spirituality that Carlo had taught her by his example. Of course, she cried a lot. Of course, there were days when the weight was almost unbearable. But in the midst of the tears, there was something else, a mysterious conviction, almost inexplicable, that Carlo wasn't really lost. She felt, in a way that went beyond reason, that her son was home. It wasn't just a phrase of comfort that someone had told her, it was a certainty that sprouted from within, as if Carlo himself were whispering in her heart, "Mom, I'm okay. I'm where I always wanted to be." This faith in the midst of tears is something that teaches us a lot about what it really means to believe. It's not that Antonia didn't suffer, she suffered terribly. It's not that she didn't feel anger or confusion, she felt them. But prayer became her anchor, the only place where she could deposit all that anguish without completely falling apart. And notice this, because it's important. She wasn't pretending to be okay. She wasn't putting on a mask of good Christian who endures everything without complaint. She was being brutally honest with God, bringing him all that raw pain, unfiltered, knowing that he could handle it. This authenticity and faith is what makes the difference between superficial religion and deep spirituality. Carlo had lived that way, real, transparent, genuine in his relationship with God, and Antonia was honoring that memory by maintaining the same authenticity. But something was about to change, something she could never have imagined. Carlo always had a special devotion to the Virgin Mary. It wasn't something forced or imposed, but a genuine relationship he cultivated from childhood. He prayed the rosary every day, talked to her as if she were his heavenly mother, asked her to intercede for the people he loved. For him, Mary wasn't a distant figure on an altar. She was a real presence, close, maternal. And Antonia had learned that from her son. During the years Carlo was alive, she saw him grow in that Marian devotion, saw him dedicate time to biblical studies about Mary, saw him always carry a rosary in his pocket. When Carlo died, that devotion became even more important to Antonia. It was as if Mary were the bridge between her and her son, the invisible thread that kept them connected despite the distance between heaven and earth. And then something extraordinary started to happen. Antonia began to experience Mary's presence in a way that went far beyond the devotional. It wasn't just praying the rosary or lighting a candle, it was feeling a real, palpable, comforting companionship. In the moments of greatest pain, when grief seemed like it would crush her, she felt a peace that didn't come from herself, an invisible embrace that sustained her. These weren't hallucinations or imaginings of a desperate mother. It was something much more solid, more real. Other people in similar situations might think she was losing her mind, but for those who live with faith, these experiences make sense. The Bible is full of accounts of people who experienced divine presence in the midst of affliction, from the prophets of the Old Testament to the apostles in the New. Antonia was living her own faith testimony, one that was preparing her for what would come next. This supernatural consolation didn't take away the pain that's important to understand. Antonia still missed Carlo every second of every day. But it gave her something that pain alone could never give her: hope. The certainty that death isn't the end, that the love uniting a mother with her son doesn't break when one of them crosses to the other side. Christianity has always taught about the communion of saints, that mysterious reality that those in heaven remain connected with those of us here on earth. For many, that's just abstract theology, nice words in a Sunday sermon. But for Antonia, it was becoming tangible, real, lived. And Mary, the mother who had also lost her son on the cross, understood perfectly what Antonia was going through. It was that mutual understanding, that shared pain, that created such a deep bond. But the Virgin Mary hadn't finished acting in Antonia's life. Something completely unexpected was about to happen. Months passed, and Antonia tried to rebuild her life piece by piece. It's not that things were easier, the pain was still there, constant, like a shadow that never left her. But she had learned to live with it, to get up every morning, even though every cell of her body wanted to stay in bed. She prayed, went to church, tried to maintain the faith that Carlo had taught her. And then came the news that would change everything. She was pregnant. But not with one baby, with two. Twins. At her age, after years without even considering another pregnancy, after everything that had happened, this was medically improbable. The doctors told her it was almost a miracle. And Antonia, between surprise and tears, knew immediately that this wasn't coincidence. It was much more than biology, much more than medical statistics. It was an answer. The pregnancy was closely followed by doctors who couldn't get over their amazement. Each ultrasound, each checkup, confirmed that those two babies were growing healthy, strong, defying all probabilities. Antonia would pass her hands over her belly and feel that Carlo was there, somehow interceding for those two lives that were forming. She couldn't prove it scientifically. Of course, faith doesn't work that way. But she knew it in the deepest part of her being. She remembered the words of the gospel about how God multiplies, how he transforms loss into abundance, how he turns mourning into dancing. And here she was, living it in her own flesh. Months passed, and each kick from the babies was like a letter from heaven, a reminder that God hadn't forgotten her, that her pain had been seen, heard, felt. When the day of birth arrived, and Antonia held Michelle and Francesca in her arms for the first time, something broke and healed at the same time in her heart. It wasn't that those babies replaced Carlo. No one could ever do that. But they were living proof that God writes redemption stories even when everything seems lost. The spiritual symbolism was impossible to ignore. Two lives where there had been death, double blessing where there had been double pain. It's as if God himself were saying, I know you lost, I know it hurts, but look what I can do with your pain if you trust me. And God's love, that love we often don't understand, had multiplied in the form of children. Antonia cried, but they were no longer just tears of pain. They were tears of wonder, of gratitude, of something that was beginning to resemble peace. And as she looked at those two little ones, she began to understand something that would forever change her way of seeing Carlo's story. Now I understand why. These were the words Antonia spoke months after the twins' birth, when she had already had time to process everything that had happened. It wasn't a phrase said lightly, nor an attempt to find cheap comfort in the midst of pain. It was a genuine revelation, a clarity that had come after much praying, much crying, much searching for meaning in chaos. She began to see how all the pieces fit together. Carlo's short life, his early devotion, his premature departure, his intercession from heaven, the twins' birth. They weren't isolated events, they were chapters of the same story, written by God. And the protagonist of that story wasn't just her, nor just Carlo, nor just the twins. It was faith itself, alive and active, showing that even in the deepest tragedies there can be purpose. Antonia began to understand something that many Christians struggle to accept, that God transforms pain into mission. It's not that he causes suffering. The world is broken. Diseases exist. Death is real. But he has this mysterious capacity to take what was destroyed and rebuild it in an even more beautiful way. Like an artist who takes fragments of broken glass and creates an impressive mosaic. Carlo had lived only 15 years, yes, but those 15 years were so full of spirituality, of purpose, of genuine love for God, that his impact surpassed that of many who live 80. His life wasn't cut short, it was complete. He had fulfilled exactly what he came to do, show that holiness is possible in the 21st century, that young people can love Jesus Christ without shame, that technology can be a tool for evangelization. And Antonia, understanding this, began to see her son's death not as an absurd ending, but as a planned journey that had fulfilled its objective. This understanding brought her a peace that no human speech could give her. And here's the deepest lesson of this whole story. No suffering is useless when lived with faith. It's not that faith removes pain that would be a lie. Pain is real, it's legitimate, it's human. But faith gives it a container where that pain can transform into something more, into testimony, into strength for others, into intercession, into hope. Antonia could have remained paralyzed in bitterness, eternally asking, "Why me?" Instead, she began to ask, "What for?" And that small two-letter difference completely changes the narrative. The what for opens space for purpose, for mission, to understand that God continues writing the story even when we no longer see the pencil moving. And just when Antonia reached this conclusion, news began to arrive of something even more extraordinary. Because Carlo hadn't stayed still in heaven. I know it sounds strange to say it like that, but it's the truth. Since he departed, testimonies started coming from all over the world of people who had prayed asking for his intercession and had received answers. We're not talking about vague coincidences or "I felt better after praying." We're talking about documented healings of impossible situations that reversed, of lives that changed radically after entrusting a need to Carlo. There were mothers who had lost hope of having children and who, after visiting his tomb and praying, became pregnant. There were terminally ill patients given up by doctors who experienced inexplicable improvements. There were young people lost in addictions who found strength to get out after learning about Carlo's faith testimony. The church, with its characteristic rigor, began to investigate these cases, to gather medical documentation, to verify the authenticity of the accounts. And in the midst of all these testimonies, there was one particular case that shone with special light: Michelle and Francesca. The twins weren't just Antonia's children, they were a living sign of Carlo's intercession. Every time someone asked how it was possible that she had twins at that age, in those circumstances, after that loss, Antonia pointed toward heaven and spoke of her son. The babies grew surrounded by this story of faith, absorbing from the cradle this certainty that the supernatural is real, that saints aren't plaster figures in churches but living people in God's presence who continue acting on behalf of those who remain here. Christianity teaches about the communion of saints, but for this family, it wasn't abstract doctrine, it was daily experience. All over the world, miracles linked to the young saint began to be documented. A Brazilian child with an incurable pancreatic malformation who healed after his mother prayed to Carlo. Cases in Italy, in Spain, in America, in Asia. It didn't matter the language, culture, or distance, Carlo was present. The Catholic Church, after rigorous investigations, officially recognized one of these miracles, which led to Carlo's beatification in 2020. Notice the speed. He died in 2006 and was beatified 14 years later. By the Church's standards, which usually take centuries in these processes, this is practically instantaneous. And all because the evidence was overwhelming, undeniable, documented. The reality of the communion of saints became tangible in the story of this kid with sneakers and a fondness for video games. And while all this was happening in the world, in Antonia's home, another equally miraculous reality was being lived. Michelle and Francesca grew up in a home that seemed to have one foot on earth and another in heaven. It wasn't a somber house, full of permanent mourning and sad photographs. On the contrary, it was a house full of life, of children's laughter, of games and typical childhood mischief. But there was something different, something any visitor noticed right away, an atmosphere of natural faith, unforced, like the air you breathe without thinking. From very young, the twins heard stories about their older brother whom they never met in person, but who felt very close. Antonia spoke to them about Carlo with joy, not with sadness. She told them how he loved dogs, how he programmed computers, how every morning he went to Mass before going to school. For Michelle and Francesca, Carlo wasn't a ghost from the past. He was a real presence, an older brother in heaven who took care of them. The twins' childhood was illuminated by this spiritual memory. When they learned to pray, Antonia taught them to talk to Carlo, to ask him for things, to thank him for taking care of the family. And the curious thing is that the children did it as naturally as they talked to any family member. There was nothing morbid or forced about it. It was as simple as sending a message to a cousin who lives in another city, only in this case, the cousin lived in heaven. Family life was marked by faith in an organic way. They went to Mass together on Sundays, prayed before meals, celebrated religious holidays with genuine joy. Not because Antonia forced them, but because she had created an environment where spirituality was something alive, attractive, real. She had learned from Carlo that religion doesn't have to be boring or heavy. It can be bright, joyful, full of meaning. And so a unique reality was being built in that house, the union between heaven and earth. The twins grew up knowing they had a saint brother interceding for them, a mother who had transformed pain into mission, a family that was living testimony that God responds, even though sometimes his answers are completely different from what we expected. Family meals, birthdays, movie nights, everything was crossed by this awareness that they were part of something greater. They didn't live in a religious bubble apart from the real world. Michelle and Francesca went to school, played with friends, watched cartoons, had their tantrums and difficult moments like any child. But they carried within a certainty that many adults spend their whole lives searching for, the certainty that love doesn't end with death, that family remains family beyond the veil, that heaven isn't as far as it seems. And while these children grew with this particular faith, their mother was discovering another dimension of her mission. Because Antonia didn't stay locked in her personal story, she could have no one would criticize her for focusing only on caring for her twins and healing her own heart. But she understood that what she had lived wasn't just for her. It was a message that needed to be shared, a testimony that could give hope to thousands of families going through similar pains. So she began to open up, to tell her story, to speak publicly about Carlo, about his death, about grief, about the twins, about how God had transformed everything. At first, it was difficult reliving the pain over and over in each interview, in each talk. But she saw how her words touched hearts, how other parents who had lost children approached her crying, telling her, "Thank you, I needed to hear this." And she understood that this was part of her mission. The exhibition of Eucharistic miracles that Carlo had created began to travel the world, and Antonia became one of its main promoters. It wasn't just a collection of photos and data, it was the tangible legacy of her son, proof that his life, though short, had been immensely fruitful. The exhibition passed through churches, schools, cultural centers, and wherever it went, Carlo's story touched lives. Young people who had never set foot in a church became interested in faith upon seeing that a kid like them, who played PlayStation and surfed the internet, had been capable of living such deep spirituality. Parents who had lost hope started praying again. People distanced from Christianity began to reconsider questions about God, about the meaning of life, about what lies beyond death. The family had become a global testimony without seeking it. It wasn't fame for fame's sake, nor empty prominence. It was service. Antonia had understood that her grief could be transformed into something that served others, that her pain could become comfort for those who suffered. And this, friends, is what evangelization really means. Not giving sermons from a distant pulpit, but sharing from one's own wound what God has done in our life. The Acutis family, with their imperfections and struggles, had become a beacon of hope. Not because they were perfect, but because they were real. They had suffered, they had cried, they had doubted, but they hadn't let go of God's hand. And that resonated with millions of people who are also holding on to that hand, tooth, and nail in the midst of their own storms. And to those very people, Antonia had something very important to tell them. Every time Antonia met parents who had lost a child, her heart broke again. She knew perfectly that pain, that feeling that the ground opens under your feet and nothing will ever make sense again. And when these parents looked at her with pleading eyes, searching for any word that could relieve even a little of the torment, she didn't give them stock phrases or cheap comfort. She spoke to them from the truth of her own experience. She told them, "I know right now you feel like you'll never be okay again. And you're right, you'll never be the same. But that doesn't mean you can't live again, smile again, find meaning again." She didn't minimize the pain, didn't try to rush it, didn't tell them that everything happens for a reason, as if that would make them feel better. Instead, she offered them something much more valuable, concrete hope. It wasn't an illusory hope of those that promise the pain will magically disappear if you pray enough. It was a hope rooted in the reality that God walks with us through the valley of the shadow of death, as Psalm 23 says. Antonia told them about the nights she spent crying, about the days when she could barely get out of bed, about the times she shouted at God asking why. But she also told them how, in the midst of that darkness, small rays of light began to filter through, a prayer that brought her peace, a dream about Carlo that gave her comfort, the inexplicable certainty that her son was okay. And then, of course, the miracle of the twins. She told them she couldn't promise them that God would give them exactly what she received, but she could assure them that God hadn't abandoned them, that He was still writing their stories even though they couldn't see the script. The faith that Antonia shared with these parents was a faith that sustains when everything crumbles. Not a superficial faith that breaks at the first blow, but a deep, rooted faith that has been tested in fire and has come out strengthened. She told them how the Bible is full of people who went through tremendous losses. Job lost everything, including his children. David mourned the death of his baby. Mary saw her son die on a cross. And yet, all these people found a way to move forward, not because the pain disappeared, but because they discovered that God was with them in the pain. The certainty that God continues writing the story, Antonia told them, is the only thing that kept me standing when I felt I couldn't go on. And those words, said by someone who had truly walked through that hell and come out the other side, had a weight that no theologian from his desk could match. Because Antonia wasn't talking about theory, she was talking about lived life, about tested faith, about hope that had been born in the midst of the darkest night. And while she shared all this with the world, her family continued to be the first and most important testimony that God's promises are real, that He truly makes all things new, that the end of this story hasn't been written yet.